Hello, everyone. Before we start the lesson for today, I want to welcome you to Introduction to Formal Reasoning and Decision Making and introduce myself a bit. I'm Kelsey Laity D'Agostino, and my connections for this course come through a couple of areas. One, philosophy of language, so that's within the branch of philosophy, and then also cognitive science, which associates philosophy with some empirical disciplines like psychology and computer science. So philosophers of language have a keen interest in some of what we're doing in this course. They like to formalize sentences and arguments of English and other human languages. And so that's some of what we'll be covering early in this course. And then cognitive scientists are interested, or at least in part interested, in characterizing how people and animals reason. Now, their interest is in more how it happens, and we're going to be doing something a little different, which is distinguishing good reasoning from bad. But later in the course, we will cover some of the common reasoning errors. So that's a bit about how I come into this course and relate to the material we'll be covering. But let me stop with rambling on and jump into our first lecture. So since our aim in the course, from beginning to end, will be to distinguish good arguments from bad ones, it's important to first get clear on the simple concept of what arguments are and what the main elements are in constructing them. So in this first part of the lesson, we'll distinguish argument and inference. We'll look at some ways to identify premises and conclusions. And importantly, we'll work on recognizing whether a sentence is a declarative statement, since those are important constituents of arguments. So what is an argument? It's pretty straightforward. It's a set of statements that offer evidence for some claim. The supporting statements we call the premises, and the claim being argued for is the conclusion. So in an argument, the premises are offered to support the conclusion. That is, the truth of the premises gives us a reason for thinking that the conclusion is true. So let's look at an example of a simple argument presented in ordinary English. Fish is healthy because it contains essential fats, and fats are necessary for organ function. Here are the parts of that argument. The conclusion is stated right up front: fish is healthy, and then it's followed by the supporting premises. Fish contain essential fats, fats are necessary for organ function. Standardly, we represent arguments as shown here, with the premises listed first, followed by the conclusion at the end. And the purpose of this is to help us easily distinguish the supporting statements from the conclusion that they support. So you have your supporting statements out front, and the thing they're supporting follows from them at the end. It's important to make the subtle distinction between argument and inference. Inference is the mental process by which we reason from some facts or information or evidence to some conclusion. Arguments can be used to represent inferences, but they're not the same thing. And that's because arguments are necessarily objects of language, either written or spoken, and not mental processes. So inference is the thing that's going on in your head, and we can represent it in language with an argument. And that's what makes analyzing arguments a good way of analyzing reasoning or inference. Arguments can represent reasoning. So as we said, arguments are in a language, and therefore they're going to be made up of statements. A statement is a single declarative sentence that is either true or false. So all of the premises as well as the conclusion must be statements. Since arguments are made up of statements, as we've just said, it's important that we distinguish them from other kinds of sentences that we might use. So the following are all statements. They're declarative sentences. Some species of mammal have 5 legs. I'm appalled by what gets called a steak in some restaurants. Whether Orcutt is guilty or not is a matter for the courts to decide. Tripe is disgusting. You should be a vegetarian. We could judge each of those statements to be true or false. In practice, making that judgment might be difficult, but in principle, the idea is we could determine for each of those 5 sentences whether it's true or whether it's false. That is not the case for the next 3 sentences, so these could not be statements of an argument. Yuck. Did you say that the House of Representatives has 438 seats? Stop eating meat. The first one here is an exclamative, the second an interrogative, and the third an imperative. You don't need to know those terms per se. What's important is that none of these sentences could be determined, even in principle, to be true or false. So they could not be the components of an argument. Now, oftentimes we run across arguments stated in plain English. So our first simple example was one of those. Fish is healthy because it contains essential fats, and fats are necessary for organ function. The challenge in plain English is that sometimes arguments can be expressed in ways that doesn't make the premises and the conclusion clear immediately. So this argument, for example, was expressed in a single sentence. But it contains one of several words that indicate that some of the information in the sentence was intended as support for a conclusion. So that was that word because. It's underlined. That word signals that what follows is offered to justify what came before it. So the first part was the conclusion, and the second part was the premise, or premises, depending on how you divide it up, and more on that later. So some of the other premise indicating words include since, for, because, after all, given, whereas, although, suppose, assume that, let us presume that, granted, is a reason to believe that, or is a reason that. Here are the facts. We can also use words to indicate the conclusion. Most commonly, therefore, but also so, consequently, it follows that. We can infer that, supports the claim that, proves, and shows. So we can look at a couple more examples of sentences in natural English that use some of these premise and conclusion indicators to see how they work. So, some guitar players are not astronauts. Given that all guitar players are musicians, it follows that some musicians are not astronauts. So, given that indicates that the sentence that follows is a premise. It follows that indicates that what follows that is the conclusion of that argument. Here's another. Let's assume that Irene either likes coffee or tea in the morning, but she doesn't like tea. This implies that Irene likes coffee in the morning. So let us assume that one of our premise indicators. Notice here that the first premise has a premise indicator. The second, she doesn't like tea, doesn't. But we signal with this implies that what follows is the conclusion, and that separates the conclusion from the premises, even in our ordinary speaking. It is important, though, to note that some of the words we looked at can be used in ways that don't make them premise or conclusion indicators, so it's worth being careful. For example, for 5 hours, they played their bass so loud that the walls shook. So long as you have an attitude like that, you won't succeed. I've been energetic since the moment I woke up this morning. All of these are cases where the indicator words have a slightly different meaning, where they aren't signaling that the sentences that contain these words are part of an argument, either the premise or the conclusion. Finally, when we think about the construction of arguments, it's worth noting that sometimes arguments can have multiple conclusions, and sometimes they can have conclusions along the way. So this first argument is one where a single premise allows us to draw two different conclusions, pretty obvious ones, but two different conclusions nonetheless. So Irene likes coffee and tea allows us to reason that Irene likes coffee and Irene likes tea. Two separate conclusions. Then in the second argument, the first two premises support the third premise. So all mammals are vertebrates. All capybaras are mammals. From that, we can conclude that all capybaras are vertebrates. Then along with the fact that Lucas is a capybara, we can conclude that Lucas is a vertebrate. So the third premise there was an intermediate conclusion that along with premise 4 supported our main conclusion. So that concludes the first part of our first lesson, and in the next one we'll introduce two broad categories of arguments that we'll cover in the course, and then introduce the main concept that we'll use in the first half of the course for evaluating arguments as good or bad.